approaching midnight on July 16, 1918. A truck is making its way along a dirt track towards a mansion in Siberia, in the newly declared People's Republic of the Soviet Union. Despite the fact the truck is behind schedule, it's crawling along at a snail's pace. At the same time, Tsar Nicholas II, the deposed Russian monarch, his wife Alexandra, his son and heir Alexei, his 4 daughters, the Grand Duchess Tatiana, the Grand Duchess Olga, and the Grand Duchesses Maria and Anastasia, and their entourage are entering a dingy cellar in the same mansion. Their fate was sealed. They would leave the cellar victims of 12 cold-blooded assassins, a testimony to the brutality of the Russian Revolution. Since that day, a mystery has surrounded one of the Tsar's daughters. Popular belief has it that it was the youngest daughter, Anastasia, who survived the assassination. In 1992, when the bones of the Tsar and his family were discovered in a forest in Siberia, completeness was added to that belief. You see, 2 bodies were missing. That of the Tsar's son and heir, Alexei, and one of his daughters. Since the assassination, a number of women have claimed to be Anastasia. These are the bones of one of those claimants. But there's a difference. During her lifetime, she never actually claimed to be Anastasia. That claim comes from some of her grandchildren today. They say that she lived her life under an assumed name, but secretly and privately, she said she was the Grand Duchess of Russia, the only surviving daughter of the Tsar. And again, unlike other claimants who chased the throne of Russia, she lived her life in fear and in hiding until the day she died. Her family sworn to secrecy, never to reveal the truth until the time was right. They say that time is now. Over the past 3 years, we have spent thousands of dollars investigating their claims. We have employed some of the world's best forensic scientists to discover whether these bones are in fact the last remains of Anastasia Romanov, the Grand Duchess of Russia. But before we reveal our findings, it's important to know what really happened on that night in 1918 when the Bolsheviks tried to snuff out the Russian royal family. What you're about to see is a reenactment of what was reported to the Central Executive Committee by Yakov Yurovsky, the man in charge of the assassination squad. According to Yurovsky, the Tsar and his family were ushered into the cellar under the pretext that fighting was breaking out nearby and that the royal family had been taken into the cellar for their own good. That was a lie. He then spun them another yarn, telling them that the people of Moscow feared that they were already dead. He told them he was going to take their photograph and send it back to Moscow to prove they were still alive. Yurovsky reported that the Tsarina Alexandra, who had weak legs, asked for a chair for herself and her hemophilic son. The plan to assassinate the Tsar and his family didn't go smoothly. As well as the truck being late, many of the guards were drunk. 12 men, including 6 Latvians, had been selected to murder the emperor and his family. Each of the 12 men had been given specific targets. Several of the Latvians refused to kill the young girls. Replacement killers were found. Inside the small cellar, the imperial family were being prepared for the bogus photographic session. Instead of a photographer, in marched Yurovsky's 12 gunmen. Yurovsky drew a piece of paper from his pocket. It was their death sentence. It read, "In view of the fact your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you." Those were the last words the Tsar heard. According to Yurovsky's account, the shooting went on for so long, the small room became so thick with acrid gun smoke, the small single light in the center of the room was almost totally dimmed. At last, the firing ceased. The assassins checked the bodies to ensure they had done their work thoroughly. Unbelievably, some of the girls were still alive. The assassins finished the job, or so they thought. Yurovsky ordered the cellar doors open to allow the smoke to clear. The gunmen again checked their handiwork. Unbelievably, Yurovsky reports that for the second time, 3 of the girls sat up screaming. With the doors open, the killers could not now shoot the survivors for fear of raising the alarm, so they stabbed them with their bayonets and bludgeoned them with their rifle butts. The bodies were wrapped in the royal family's own bed linen and taken out to the truck for disposal. What was it that had caused the Tsar's children such vitality, as Yurovsky called it in his report? Why were they so difficult to kill? Was it divine intervention, as some of the killers feared? Not at all. As it turned out, the girls were wearing corsets lined with diamonds and other jewels. So many, they deflected the bayonets and bullets alike. So that was the official account of how the Tsar and his family died. Not just Yurovsky's account, but the account of as many as 6 or 7 other eyewitnesses. All sufficiently different, and all sufficiently the same to make it believable. Believable, that is, until it comes to the burial of the royal family in the forest close to Ekaterinburg. As we have already said, mysteriously, the bodies of 2 of the Tsar's children were missing. There is no doubt that Alexei was not buried with the rest of the family, but there is some doubt as to whether, in fact, it was Anastasia or Maria's body that was missing. Nevertheless, popular belief has it that it was Anastasia who somehow, miraculously, lived the onslaught of the bullets and the bayonets. But how did they escape that slaughter in the cellar of Ipatiev house, the house of special purpose as it was called, and after they had been wrapped in cloth and tossed, presumed dead, in the back of the truck? As for Alexei, the youngest of the royal family, his fate is not for this program. With regard to Anastasia, the tales are many and long. The most notorious being that of Anna Anderson. For many years, in fact for nearly half a century, this woman claimed to be Anastasia. Her story is well known. But in the early 1990s, DNA testing proved conclusively that she was not Anastasia Romanov. So what happened to that missing girl presumed to be Anastasia? How was she rescued? And what was the eventual fate of that pretty teenager who witnessed her whole family mercilessly gunned down before her very eyes? Where did she escape to? And how did she live out her life? Could the answer be tied up with these two men? Could this be Anastasia Romanov in her early 20s? Is this her husband? And are these her children?
South Africa, with all its wildlife and scenery, it's one of those magic places. This is KwaZulu, the heart of Zululand. This is where the Zulu nation defeated the British. It's the last place you'd expect to find the remains of Anastasia Romanov, the Russian Duchess who escaped when her family was murdered by the Bolsheviks.
The man on the left is Louis de Waal. At 57, he is a retired carpenter, a Mauritian born in South Africa during World War II. Today, he lives in Perth, Australia. The other man with him is Albert Antonovich, his stepbrother. He is a South African. It is this woman, his grandmother, and Louis' step-grandmother they want us to believe was Anastasia Romanov. She stood 5'4" tall and went by the name of Granny Alina.
You know, my grandmother always saying that she was a duchess. I honestly and truly believe today that she could be Anastasia, the Grand Duchess of Russia.
For years, the two men lived in a small township in KwaZulu, north of Durban. They grew up in an area which is today close to the region's main nature reserve. Every year, thousands of tourists flock to marvel at the wildlife. And the world-renowned Zulu dances. The two men are stepbrothers because Louis' mother and Albert's father lived together until Albert's father died. Years later, Louis and his mother immigrated to Australia. But in 1996, Louis returned to South Africa and was reunited with his stepbrother.
Yeah.
The pair had a quest to fulfill. Their quest to gather evidence to prove their belief that their grandmother was Anastasia Romanov, the only surviving Grand Duchess of Russia.
There was a photograph of her that I can remember. I think it was her parents. She did say, that is my family with a lot of people, but I can't remember details.
Oh, this is our old house, isn't it?
As the two men revisit their childhood homes, they remember what it was like back in the old days. Not the good old days, because back then they lived in fear. In fear of the racist apartheid system, which said because their parents were different colours, they couldn't be married. Therefore, by living together, they were breaking the law. But they say their grandmother lived in fear of a different kind. In fear of discovery. In fear of being kidnapped. In fear of assassination.
But it's all stories, you know, shh, don't tell anybody, you know.
She lived in fear of a forgotten princess in exile.
The reason that she wanted to keep it a secret, Michael, first of all, that she had stressed that she escaped from the revolution, and she was always afraid of the KGB.
You know, she always used to say, but Albert, you know, you must be careful, the police, you know. If they come, they're going to take me away, and they'll kill me. You know, you must keep quiet. You know, the KGB, these people, they're terrible people, the things they've done to my family. And she never told you what she did. You know, she never said, you know, they did this or they did that. But just that you could see that terrified look. If a police van rode past, then she used to go into her room and close her curtains and stay in the room. If there were strangers coming to the house, exactly the same thing. She would go into her room and close her room. She wouldn't come out.
Well, this is the house we sold in '64, you know, before we moved to Red Hill. This is our old place. Anyone at home? Is anyone home?
The memories flooded back to Albert and Louis as they visited their old homes.
Mr. Siffel, do you remember me? Oh, gee, it's lovely to see you again. This is Albert. And, of course, where we're standing here is the entrance of our lounge.
This would be the kitchen.
The kitchen, which was now converted into the bathroom.
This was my grandmother's room.
Do you remember that photo that used to be on this wall here?
That's right, Louis.
That's when she was dressed in
that national uniform.
yes, outfit of hers.
But that photograph is long gone. These photographs are the only remaining photos of Granny Alina. This is the only one of her as a young woman with her family. The rest, according to Albert, were destroyed in a flood. Her husband was known as Frank. He used to run a blacksmith shop with Louis' maternal grandfather. Frank died in 1945 and was buried here in Impangeni. Little is known of this man, save that he was 37 years older than his wife Alina. A huge gap, even by today's liberal standards. It's in another graveyard that Louis first came to know Granny Alina.
In April of 1954, was when my grandfather passed away in Verulam. And Helena Antonovich attended the funeral. She was all dressed up in black. And that's the first time that I really had a direct contact with her, because she had her arms around me and consoling me the death of my grandfather.
Louis' mother had known Alina for some years, and after the funeral renewed the acquaintance and became friendly with Alina's son. It was after this that they moved in together.
I mean, every time we came
Louis,
down, which was
whose own father died some years before, now found himself with a new stepfather, step-grandmother and stepbrother called
pulled out
Albert.
all the grass out. That's going back about 4 years ago.
That's right. Yeah.
And we
Albert was a
always
huge man,
recognised
towering more than
that
6'4". A big lad to be the grandson of 5'3" or 4" grandparents.
everything in her will was left to her grandchildren, and they weren't allowed to sell the house or the farm or anything. It had
Perhaps
to
a
be
clue to just what may have happened so many years earlier.
Kitchen at the back.
Albert had leukemia and died in 1997.
Dining room, you know, you could fit 26 people or something on the table. It was fantastic atmosphere.
Albert knew he was dying and was grateful of the chance to revisit his childhood homes with Louis and to begin the long road of trying to piece together their grandmother's stories. The process to discover the truth, though he knew he'd never finish it.
I feel it will bring the Russian nation together. Peace. It could bring them together. And I feel be given the recognition. All these years that she was terrified of the KGB or the Russian people coming to kill her, and her grandchildren. Her grandchildren were the most important things in her life. Everything she did was for her grandchildren, and she was terrified that they were the ones that were going to be hurt because of her. And all this has stopped. The Russian people are not against their Tsar and those type of people. If she went back now, I feel it would unite the Russian nation, which had been at war since then. There've never been peace in Russia, and it would unite them. We would never ever take any notice of
Oh,
this
no,
thing,
no.
you know, when
But
she
no,
wanted
I
to
recall
talk.
that because it was the father had the beard and the mother was next, but it was an oval frame, it was a tortoise frame.
Louis and his mother,
Frame.
Albert and his father, and Granny Alina lived together on and off for almost 10 years. It was during these years that Louis and Albert heard the stories of how Granny Alina escaped.
Flag
Also
there.
with that round tortoise shell, if a police or anything stopped you, so run inside,
That's
close
right.
the door, close the curtains quickly and peek.
And the people who's out there, yeah, I
So
remember that,
scared
Albert,
was she
yeah.
of the secret police.
They say she never spoke about that dreadful night when the rest of her family were gunned down, but she freely told of her escape. She told the boys that although her memory was dim, she recalls that she was in the back of a truck. There was a lot of noise and faces. She remembered that she and Alexei were rescued by a group of men, that she remembered seeing a fat old lady in the headlights of the truck near a railway crossing as they were carried off into the misty night. This is the most compelling piece of anecdotal evidence. You see, it ties in perfectly with what Yurovsky said in his report about the assassination. But the interesting thing is that that report wasn't published in Russia until the 1980s, and in the West until 1993. That's almost 40 years after Granny Alina told the story to Louis and Albert. Here then is the official account, according to Yurovsky, of what happened after the assassination. After the murder, the man in charge of the truck, Comrade Ermakov, was so drunk, Yurovsky couldn't trust him to dispose of the bodies, so he went along with the burial detail. They had driven some 7 miles towards the mine shaft that Ermakov had earmarked as the burial site, but they became bogged and the truck's engine overheated. It was by a railway crossing, and the driver of the truck was sent to get help from the crossing attendant, a fat old lady. While the driver was getting water for the overheated engine, Yurovsky and the drunken Ermakov went off into the woods to find the troops who were supposed to meet the death truck to help bury its gruesome cargo. It's at this time, according to the two men, that their princess was rescued. It was while the truck driver was walking back from the railway crossing with the old woman, and while Yurovsky and Ermakov were in the woods searching for the rest of the burial detail, that someone or a group of people took the opportunity to check the back of the truck to see if anyone was still alive, and if they were, to rescue them. Who those people were, we have no idea. But this is the exact story that was told to Louis and Albert in the 1950s. So how did she escape the revolutionaries to make her way to South Africa? And how did she survive the harsh political environment in South Africa? And how did she become to be buried in an unmarked grave in a township in KwaZulu, just outside Durban? According to Louis and Albert, she was passed along an escape route to St. Petersburg, then by boat to Poland. She told them she was hidden inside a wooden crate, and she could hear fighting and gunfire nearby.
She was actually a stowaway on the ship. And as the ship was leaving the harbor, they were fighting. There was fighting on the ship, and these peasants were being thrown overboard, you know, trying to get to these, the royalty and, of course, the upper class that were escaping. They didn't want anybody to escape.
There are unconfirmed reports from Poland of Anastasia's nighttime arrival. They say that she had a serious head wound which had to be attended to, that upon her arrival she changed her name, and that she was immediately baptized into the Roman Catholic Church. Louis and Albert say that she stayed in Poland for a number of years in hiding and regaining her strength. But where to from there? To Berlin. But how did she get from Berlin to South Africa?
According to Albert, she had the help of a relative in Germany, a baron. The identity of the baron is still a mystery, but we mustn't forget that Anastasia's mother, the Tsarina Alexandra, was in fact the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Therefore, Anastasia would have had aunts and uncles in Germany who would have doubtlessly jumped to her aid. So according to Albert and Louis, the Baron arranged
false identity for Anastasia. But the two men know nothing more, leaving many questions still unanswered. Was Frank really her husband, or was this all part of the ruse to aid her escape? Remember, he was 37 years her senior. Could he have been a Cossack bodyguard? Maybe even this man, one of the Imperial Guards. And what of the two boys? Were they really the offspring of Granny Alina and Frank, as the family believes? Or were they too part of an elaborate cover-up, part of a made-up family, again to aid her escape? Unfortunately, there are no reliable records available to prove this theory one way or the other. Frank died in 1945. So did part of the truth to this tale. Granny Alina, or the Grand Duchess, lived on, and so did her mystery. But the time has come to put these men's claim to the test, which is exactly what they want. London, England, the home of the world's oldest police force, the Metropolitan Police. Their headquarters, New Scotland Yard. Every year they investigate thousands of mysteries. Missing persons, kidnappings, murders. Their forensic detectives use a number of scientists around Britain to help them solve their mysteries. They recommended Manchester University's Art in Medicine department to help solve our case.
The department covers a wide range of areas. We are most renowned for facial reconstruction, and we also do a lot of work in photo comparison. The department traditionally produced a lot of artwork for textbooks, medical textbooks, and we also do quite a lot of work for the university. So more recently in that, we do a lot more photo comparison work. It roughly constitutes about 80% of our work. And the reconstructions, we may have 1 or 2 archaeological reconstructions a year, and maybe 1 forensic.
We could match those two.
Yeah.
And those two.
Yeah, the angles are quite similar, actually.
The photographs of Granny Alina, our Anastasia, and the real Anastasia were left with these scientists.
It must be worth looking under the grants then. I'll go and see if they actually match.
Well, the difficulties that we find with this sort of work is the differences in position of the person in the photograph and the different camera angles. For example, if the head is tilted upwards and downwards, it changes all the vertical dimensions of the face, and if it's tilted from side to side, it alters all the horizontal ones. But you can, if you get photographs from a similar sort of angle, then you can still do the comparison as long as everything isn't too far out.
Further down and then we turn left again. We should be there. Now, slowly, we got to get into Flint Street. F-I... Flint.
In South Africa, Albert decided he wanted to exhume the remains of his grandmother, and with Louis' help, take the remains back to Australia for DNA testing. Arrangements were made for the exhumation with a Durban undertaker.
Well, Albert, it looks, the old things are coming together, isn't it? So Mr. Dove can get everything together. Jim, after all this month, and how are you?
Very well, man.
That's
Good
lovely, yes.
The men knew where Granny Alina was buried, but there was a problem. As we have already said, there are no records of this woman's existence in South Africa, and that includes a death certificate and burial records, which meant permission to exhume the body was going to be difficult to obtain.
Well, we haven't really sort of ascertained exactly where the place of burial is.
Yeah.
According to that stone, like there's been nothing added to that, and you would have thought that they would have added something to that.
Yes.
All the two men knew for certain was the family history, that Granny Alina's body was collected from the hospital by her 2 sons. She was buried at night and in secret, either on top of
or next to her husband Frank.
Right.
The undertaker
If I could have
agreed
those
to help.
documents, Louis, just so that I can peruse them.
Yes.
Have you got them here with you?
Unfortunately, the emotional strain was proving too much for Albert. The leukemia took a turn for the worse, and he had to return to Johannesburg for medical treatment.
That we've made, they're definitely my family.
That was the last Louis saw of his childhood friend.
At High Flats.
Albert died a few months later. Louis was left to carry the flame alone. He and Albert had already identified the gravesite, and some days later, Louis and some local council workers began the gruesome task of exhuming their Anastasia's remains. As well as speaking of the secret burial of Granny Alina in this plot, the family's oral history tells that Alina had been taken ill and was admitted to this hospital. In her final years, she was suffering with diabetes. In 1968, she was brought here to Gray's Hospital in Pietermaritzburg, where she died. But ironically, the night before she passed away, she was full of life, sitting up in bed, singing Russian lullabies. The next day, she died of a heart attack. Again, however, there are no records remaining of her admittance or of her death. At the gravesite, the exhumation seemed to be going well. The family story tells, even after her death, the secrecy continued. Family tradition says that the old lady was secretly buried in this plot by her two sons. However, local council records show that all that's buried here is her husband and a stillborn child. Standing by the gravesite, it's not difficult to imagine what it was like here in 1969 when, in the dead of night, Alina's two sons, believing their mother to be the Grand Duchess of Russia and wanted by the KGB, secretly buried her with Frank, her husband, and her bodyguard. The exhumation continued, but as the diggers went deeper and deeper, it soon became apparent that there was only one body in the grave, that of Frank. There was no sign of Alina, their Anastasia.
How many?
Just one solid ground bottom.
Nothing else, eh?
Solid. I took the
So is that only one?
only one.
You wouldn't know the difference which
No, I wouldn't know.
As we have already said,
No, here,
the story
that-
is complicated somewhat by the fact that the local council has no record whatsoever of the old lady's burial. As we have already said, the records show that in the grave next to Frank were the remains of a stillborn child, apparently one of his grandchildren. And that presented a serious problem. Louis and Albert didn't have permission to exhume the grave of this stillborn child. It looked impossible. It looked as if their quest was over. In Manchester, the forensic artists have been looking at the photographic evidence, comparing the photographs of the real Anastasia to those of Granny Alina. One of the problems the scientists had to overcome was the fact that the photographs of the real Anastasia and those of Granny Alina were taken at different angles and from different distances, making it very difficult to get a good match.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And what about this one?
I'm still a little bit unsure about the nose. The nose does seem quite wide, but she is, a lot older there.
Proportionally
So,
better.
yeah, definitely. When we first received the Anastasia photographs, actually we studied all the photographs that were actually given to us, and tried to select photographs of Anastasia that matched as close as possible to the photographs of the young mother and the old lady. So
So if we could do a comparison of those two angles.
yeah, okay.
It's a bit off, but those two are good. Could match those
Yeah,
two.
okay, they do seem quite close actually. I'll just go and take them to Grant's Enlarger and that and just see if we get a closer match-up.
The Grant's Enlarger enables the scientists to produce a simple outline of her face. our case, they were able to increase the size of the real Anastasia's face to match the face of Granny Alina. But before they did that, they first compared the face of the young Granny Alina with that of the old Granny Alina to make sure that they matched, and in fact they were the same person.
You'll put the photograph of one underneath on the flatbed, and then you can take a tracing of that. That's so you have actually a permanent image of it, and then you can replace that image with the photograph, well, as we did of the young mother, and put the tracing over the top, and you adjust to try and get them to match as close as possible.
They matched, and our forensic artists are happy that both the old woman and the young woman with the children are one and the same. They were also confident that they had enough good matches between the photographs of the real Anastasia and Granny Alina to come up with a result. And while the forensic artists at Manchester University continued their scientific investigations, back at the graveside there was some good news. As if by a miracle, permission was given to exhume the grave of the stillborn child next to Frank's grave. There was one very strict condition. If any remains of a child were found, then the exhumation was to cease immediately. It was a tense time. As the African diggers drove their spades into the rich red earth, it soon became apparent that the grave was a full-size grave.
Yep.
Is there a casket down there?
Yeah, you should get the skeleton of the remains.
It was not a half-size grave, as you'd expect if a child was buried there. The diggers continued. Down and down they went, deeper and deeper. No signs of a child's remains. They had reached the 6-foot deep mark, and suddenly they found something. It was the body of an adult.
Fingertips. That's definitely
They carefully scraped back the soil.
The lace is there. Any more lace? No.
There before their very eyes, totally against council records, the remains of a 5-foot 3-inch woman.
What is that? It's a vertebrae. A vertebrae, yes, that's important. You need a vertebrae.
Complete with false teeth and part of her burial gown.
Has she got false teeth?
Yep.
Great, grab it.
Are these the remains of Anastasia Romanoff?
Any hair?
No hair.
Nothing.
After all these years, could at last the mystery be solved? There was only one way to be sure, and that was to get these remains back to Australia and analyse this person's DNA. Oxford, England. One of the world's highest seats of learning. The home of the dark blues, Oxford University.
And the bigger the circle, the more people are.
Professor Brian Sykes is a world leader in DNA research.
Bigger circles, right.
One of the world's top DNA detectives.
Of course, DNA in any individual is very personal. There's no one else in the world, unless you have an identical twin, that has exactly the same genes. But there are a lot of genes in DNA.
But it's not this person's individual DNA that we're going to be looking for, rather something called mitochondrial DNA.
But this gene, mitochondrial DNA, as we call it, which is concerned with the energy production in the cell, it's a very important gene, but it only comes from your mother. So she gets it from her mother, and she gets it from her mother. So there's a single line right back into the deep past So at any point in the past, be it 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000, even 100,000 years ago, there's only ever been one woman alive at the time who's passed this mitochondrial DNA down to you. So it's a really very useful way of looking into the deep past.
And that is what we'll be trying to extract from these bones.
And here is the right femur, in very good condition. Second cervical vertebra, really quite tiny.
Back in Australia, Granny Alina's remains are delivered to the Victorian Institute of Forensic Science, attached to Monash University in Melbourne. Professor David Ranson is one of Australia's chief DNA detectives, a forensic pathologist. He and his team were more than keen to take a look at these bones.
And there's one or two interesting
defects on the surface there.
But, just erosion that one would expect.
Their plan was to extract mitochondrial material and compare it with Britain's Prince Philip, the husband of the Queen of England. He is the only living relative who has the same maternal bloodline as Anastasia. Like Anastasia, a direct descendant of Queen Victoria. Therefore, the two of them will share the same maternal or mitochondrial DNA.
Yeah, remarkable for 25 years.
It is really, isn't it? And see what the other ones are.
Yes.
However, despite the fact the bones were in good condition, Professor Ranson's team were unable to extract any DNA material. In their report, they say they were concerned about proceeding any further. Concerned about contamination.
We just couldn't extract sufficient DNA to make a reliable test. But certainly there's always a danger when you have a specimen that hasn't been well preserved of getting cross-contamination.
This was a major blow to the family's efforts to prove that their granny was in fact Anastasia Romanov, the Grand Duchess of Russia.
Okay, this is the remnants of the skull. And,
What's more, at some time between being sent to Monash University in Melbourne and the remains being returned to Louis in Perth, the skull of Granny Alina had become severely damaged. Undeterred, and in keeping with his promise to his stepbrother Albert, Louis and his friends spent 2 years trying to raise enough money to send the bones to Oxford University, where Professor Brian Sykes had already agreed to try to succeed where Monash had failed. During those 2 years, Granny Alina's remains were in the keeping of an undertaker's in Duval's hometown.
Be blessed and go forward, good Christian, on your journey from this world.
As a mark of respect for Granny Alina, who had been buried secretly in South Africa so many years earlier, Louis arranged for the blessing of a priest to send her on her way.
Have mercy on your servant Anastasia, God the Son, Redeemer of the world.
The local media looked on.
From the dental point of view, that she probably had these teeth out a lot earlier here.
I think we need to actually see it.
Forensic dentist Dr. Stephen Knotts and forensic scientist Laurie Webb agreed to oversee the packing of the remains for the trip to Oxford. Like his contemporaries in Australia, Professor Brian Sykes at Oxford is acutely aware of the same pitfalls that plagued Monash University in Australia, the threat of contamination.
Well, so DNA is a very stable chemical, so we don't have to worry too much about being too careful about keeping things in the freezer and fridge and so on. What we must avoid is getting any contamination of the bone from the environment. It's not too easy to get to be absolutely sure that what you get out is what was in there in the first place. It's very easy to contaminate the bones, basically. And so there's been a lot of false optimism. So, for example, people saying they can get DNA from dinosaur bones, 65, 120 million years old, and it turned out in the end not to be ancient DNA at all, but to be something that's contaminating coming in from the present day.
It's because of the threat of contamination that Professor Sykes and his team take so much care.
It's not too hot in here today, is it?
No, it is.
They take the bones into a special clean room.
I think we'll take a drilling from here, shall we?
It was with the fear of contamination in mind that Professor Sykes and his team began the delicate job of extracting the DNA material.
It's quite coloured, isn't it, really? I mean, it's amazing that it's, compared to some of the things we've seen, that are thousands of years old. And it's only been in the ground for 30 years, and yet... can you give me a couple more waybaits, Catherine?
The process is quite straightforward.
Yeah.
First he places tape around the area he intends to drill.
Right. I'll now start to clean the area. You don't want to get too big a hole there because otherwise the dust will fall into the marrow cavity. Can you smell that smell of burning? There's a slight smell of burning over here, which is always a good sign, because it smells like when you burn your hair, you know, and it's the protein. That's right. So we abrade the surface, get rid of the surface material, and then work on the inside of the bone, usually a femur or something where there's a lot of dense bone, which seems to preserve the DNA best of all. So we take that out, and then we'll get rid of the mineral.
And we can see that it really is very fragile, and this perhaps explains why it has broken into many separate pieces.
While Professor Sykes and his team begin the delicate process of hopefully extracting some DNA material, we have enlisted the help of another forensic scientist.
Here we have a small fragment of the palate, the top of the mouth.
Professor Andrew Chamberlain.
But it's really
Professor Chamberlain is a forensic anthropologist who specialises in
archaeology. Top of the
archaeology.
cranial vault. It's a piece of the frontal. You can just see the crest running up here forwards.
In fact, he featured in the BBC TV series Meet the Ancestors. More specifically, he helped identify the Wharfden woman.
Mastoid process here. Because we have some fresh breakage lines along here, I'm hoping to identify the pieces of bone which fit onto those, and I'll be able to attach them and hopefully build the skull forward.
We have asked him to reconstruct the skull of Granny Alina, put a face on her, and determine whether it could be Anastasia Romanoff.
The techniques we're going to use on this skull are having reconstructed the face as best we can, and having taken a photograph of that reconstruction. I'm then going to use forensic methods to indicate where the soft tissue features of the face, the eyes, the nose and the mouth would have been positioned, using the skull or the image of the skull as a kind of framework to place these soft tissue features back on to a drawing of the face. A lot of research has been done to establish the standard measurements that one can use to position the pupils of the eyes. They are positioned not only in relation to the eye socket, but there are features of the bony part of the face vertically under the pupils. So we can align these structures with the other parts of the bony skeleton of the face, so we can get them into position. Using the position of the eyes as a sort of baseline, we're looking at the distance from the level of the eyes to the nose, the size of the nose in relation to the rest of the face, and then moving downwards, the position of the mouth in relation to the nose and to the eyes. This is the important region of the face as far as facial recognition is concerned. When we distinguish between people with different faces, what we're talking about is, to a large extent, the relative positions of the eyes, the eyebrows above the eyes, the nose and the mouth.
And as I get towards the centre, it's becoming even softer. Now I'm just breaking into the marrow cavity.
Back in Oxford, Professor Sykes is making progress.
I was quite optimistic, having seen how good the bone was when I drilled into it. I didn't like the look of it when I first saw it, but when I drilled into the bone, it was clearly pretty solid. Okay, so I would say we've got about 100 milligrams, so maybe a bit less, but that should be enough. It should be enough. It should be enough. That's good. It's good. It's good solid stuff. It's not powdery really. It's good. You can see how it's turning round, and it's a nice powder. It's perfectly good to extract straight from that without having to do any more.
Now the material is placed in a centrifuge overnight. Meanwhile in Sheffield, Andrew Chamberlain has finished rebuilding the skull.
What I'll be doing is I'll be estimating on the skull where the eyes and the nose were located, and I will then mark in on an overlay on the computer screen the position of the eyes and the pupils at the centre of the eyes, the position of the nose. And I will then move that overlay on top of a similar overlay which I've constructed on the various photographs that we have. And I'll be able to move the outline drawing of the skull around to see which face, if any, it best matches. We will start by establishing a baseline by comparing the different pictures of Anastasia with herself. That gives us an idea of the amount of error that is just in comparing two different photos of the same person. We'll then make the comparisons between the real Anastasia, if you like, and the person who we think might have been Anastasia in later life. So we'll be able to compare those different faces.
So you've got this angle of the jaw,
yeah,
which seems quite similar.
And what about with this, the older?
Yeah.
So now we have 4 of the world's top forensic detectives, all trying to determine whether the remains that were removed from an unmarked grave in South Africa are those of Anastasia Romanov, the Grand Duchess of Russia. If they are, then one of the 20th century's greatest mysteries will have been solved. If they're not, then Louis and Albert's quest will have been for naught. But there is a surprise waiting, a result that could change the Romanov myth completely. There is some good news and some bad news on the way from Manchester University. After establishing that the older woman and the woman with the young family are one and the same, the team from Manchester University began the painstaking task of comparing the photographs with those of the real Anastasia. In the year before the assassination of the Tsar and his family, all the girls had measles and they had their heads shaven. Fortunately, they were game enough to have their photographs taken with their bald heads. Our forensic scientists used these photographs as their yardstick.
This is the outline of Anastasia from the photograph of all the 4 daughters together. And then this is the outline of the lady from South Africa. We superimpose the 2 outlines so that the inner canthal, the inner corner of the eyes, are superimposed and matched at the same distance. And when you do that, as you can see, the rest of the face doesn't correspond at all. The length of the nose is different, the position of the mouth is different, the chin is in a completely different place. And even accounting for age, this suggests that it's not the same person. You can see it again on another two outlines of Anastasia from a different photograph, and then the lady from South Africa in a younger photograph. When the inner canthae are matched up, as you can see, the faces are completely different sizes, which suggests that Anastasia had a wider distance between the inner canthae than the woman in the photograph. So if you line up the inner canthal distance and superimpose the two outlines, you can see that the two faces are completely different sizes, which suggests that it's a different person.
Bad news. The Manchester scientists have proven conclusively that the skull is not that of Anastasia Romanov, a result that was never looked for and the last thing that was expected.
If we were taking this, if this was like a case that we'd taken on for the police or something or whatever, because we found numerous differences, like with the length of the nose and that, we would usually exclude and say that it's unlikely to be the same person. We don't tend to give percentages, so we would just, as I say, state that it was unlikely to be the same person.
Yeah, all the evidence would suggest that it's not, that she's not Anastasia.
But then another revelation, and equally unexpected. A whole new twist to the story began to emerge.
I've been looking at these photographs again, and there seems to be a much stronger resemblance.
A suggestion from the forensic artists at Manchester that the remains could in fact be those of one of Anastasia's sisters. If this is true, it will completely change the whole Anastasia mystery.
Proportionally better.
Yeah, definitely. The face is kind of rounder, it's not quite as long.
They continued their investigations.
And I think what we should do is have a look on the grants and then see if there's a better match-up. Yes, yeah.
Meanwhile, totally unaware of the new developments, back in Sheffield, Professor Andrew Chamberlain completed his comparisons of the photos and the reconstructed skull.
What I've been doing over the last few days is to use a computer scanner to scan in images. Now, what I found when I compared the face from the skull with that of Princess Anastasia was that with the eyes in the correct place, Anastasia's nose was much too long for the face from the skull. So the nose and indeed the mouth, the region of the mouth below the nose, could not be fitted onto this overlay if the eyes were in the correct place. Equally, if I put the nose and the mouth in the right place, the eyes were too low.
So Professor Chamberlain came up with the same result as the Manchester scientists.
The conclusion I come to from my work is that this face is not the face of Anastasia.
Using two different methods and working totally independent of one another, Manchester University and Sheffield University came to the same conclusion. The remains are not those of Anastasia Romanov. But again, like Manchester, Professor Chamberlain declares there is a strong family resemblance and suggests that the remains could in fact be those of one of Anastasia's sisters. But which sister?
There seems to be a much stronger resemblance, proportion-wise, between Maria than with Anastasia.
Anastasia was just 17 when the family was murdered. The sister closest to her age was Maria. She was just 19. And there were only 3 inches difference in the girl's height.
I think the features are a lot closer. The nose length seems a lot shorter on Maria than it does on Anastasia.
Oh, yeah.
And
the width of the face as
well. The width of the face,
yeah.
It's, as I said, you've got this angle of the jaw,
yeah,
which seems quite similar.
Since the discovery of the Tsar's bones in the forest near Ekaterinburg in the early 1990s, the Russians have insisted that it was Maria's bones that were missing, not Anastasia. In fact, at their funeral in July 1998, the Russian authorities said it was Olga
Tatjana and Anastasia's remains that were buried along with the Tsar and Tsarina, and not Maria's. As we said right at the beginning of this program, Granny Alina never claimed to be Anastasia. She just claimed to be the Grand Duchess. It was because of popular belief that it was Anastasia who escaped that Albert and Louis assumed their Granny Alina was Anastasia.
Yeah, there's a stronger similarity with the face shape, the shape of the jaw. The shape of the eyebrows is more comfortable with Maria than with Anastasia. The nose length, again, fits in quite well. As I said, it was very long on Anastasia, and there was no way that was actually ever going to fit in. But it's a lot more comfortable. I think it's much more likely to be Maria.
It is a reasonably good fit. Certainly the nose and the eyes are in the correct position. The eyebrows are in approximately the right position.
Again, using a totally different technique and working totally independently, Professor Chamberlain agrees.
I think I am surprised by the fit between the face and that of Maria. Every individual's face is different, so on the law of averages, we wouldn't expect two people taken at random, two different people, to have the same face. So when you do find that a face matches that of another individual, yes, it is surprising, and it is often significant. So we have two people, or possibly one person, whose faces are similar, and that is a significant finding.
To be safe, Professor Chamberlain then compared Maria's face with the computer-generated Miss Average, a face which he uses as a yardstick.
Anastasia's nose was
It is the average white female,
white female,
the most common European face shape.
What this tells, what I'm able to infer from that, is in what way does the skull and the face that goes on the skull depart from the average face? In other words, is it longer or shorter? Is it broader or narrower?
The conclusion is that the face of Maria and of Alina are both substantially different from the common face. Both are shorter. In fact, both Maria and Alina have unusual facial characteristics, and both their unusual facial characteristics are the same.
I've already established that it's not an average face, it is a distinctive face, and it's distinctive in being shortened in the lower region. We know that Alina has that face, and we know that Maria has that face.
Can we therefore say that Alina and Maria are one and the same person? The answer seems to be yes.
There is nothing in the face which says it cannot be the same person.
There doesn't appear to be anything that would exclude them from being the same person, and so she could be Maria.
Perhaps it is reassuring that independently we have come up with the same result. In other words, I don't think this result is a random finding or a coincidence, or indeed an artifact of perhaps my subconsciously wanting the face to look like one person or like another person. When I started doing this facial reconstruction, I hadn't thought of the possibility that the face might belong to someone other than Anastasia. But the face that has emerged from this work has ended up looking not like Anastasia, but very like one of her sisters. That is a surprising finding, and possibly a significant one.
These pictures then show there's little doubt that Granny Alina is in fact Maria Romanov, the Grand Duchess of Russia, that these two people are one and the same, that it was not Anastasia who survived, as was believed, but it was Maria who has been the lost princess. But we still have the DNA results to consider. Will they confirm this remarkable finding? Will the DNA evidence substantiate this new claim that Granny Alina is Maria Romanov? It took just 2 weeks for the results to come back from Oxford University.
Over here I have the sequence as it came back from the machine at position 111.
His preliminary results, unfortunately, are not what we want to hear.
In the reference sequence it's a C, in the bone it's also a C. If it had been a Romanov, those would have been T's and not C's. So, the conclusion is that this bone did not come from one of the Tsarina's children. Sad news. We were all very excited. The DNA looked very good. The circumstantial evidence looked very good.
His results from the femur suggest that the bone comes from a person with a most common European DNA, therefore not Anastasia Romanoff, or any other Romanoff for that matter.
We can fit in this person into this scheme, which you've seen before, which sort of links all the mitochondrial DNA that we find in Europe. It is a European, you'll be glad to know, but you probably knew that anyway. It's not a South African, you can be sure, at least not a native South African. And the sequence is right bang in the middle of this sequence here. The Romanov sequence would have been out here, and not very far away, but not close enough, I'm afraid.
However, on hearing that the skull strongly appears to be that of Maria, Professor Sykes agrees to test the other femur and to try and extract DNA from the skull.
Because it's the skull that was used as the basis of the circumstantial evidence for the facial reconstructions. And that's what we'll try and do. I mean, we've done skull a few times, but it's not something that curators like to let us get our hands on, to be honest. And it's not so good as the femur. But if the femur's from another body, then we'll do it on the skull.
The results from those tests are as astonishing as the suggestion that the skull is that of Maria Romanoff. The DNA analysis says the skull has a totally different DNA to that of the rest of the bones. So what is going on? We have one set of bones with two DNA sequences, neither of which are Romanoff. There are a number of reasons why there are two different mitochondrial DNA sequences from the same skeleton. The first and most obvious is that there are two white women of the same age and the same height in the same grave. The video evidence speaks for itself. There was only one body in the grave. The next possibility is that one body was made up of two different women, the top half different from the bottom half. Something very suspicious must have gone on for that to be the case, especially as both women were the same age, the same height, and both European, especially in a predominantly black area of South Africa.
Okay, so you're going to ring Jim up?
Yep.
Yes, and when will it be ready?
The next explanation is that the undertakers in South Africa mixed up the bones. Again, very unlikely, as it draws a long bow to believe that the remains of two white women of the same age and same height that had been in the ground for the same length of time would have been exhumed and on the undertaker's slab together. Likewise in Melbourne, at the State Morgue, under the control of Monash University, it would be too much of a coincidence to believe that two white women of the same age and height that had been in the ground for the same period of time would be on the mortician's slab next to one another.
Yes. As you said, the small asteroids and psych portion here.
That then leaves us with Oxford University. Again, the video evidence testifies to the fact that there was no mix-up of bones and that every precaution against modern contamination was taken by Oxford. So what is the reason for there being two mitochondrial results from the same body? Was it some form of contamination, or was there a mix-up of bones somewhere along the way? The most likely cause? The one thing all the DNA detectives feared: contamination.
I think once you demonstrate there is a mixed result, it puts everything into doubt. Because once you've got an apparent intact skeleton with all the body parts or the bony parts in the correct sequence, therefore to all intents and purposes, one individual, unless you're going to postulate that something very unusual and potentially suspicious has occurred, like a head has been transplanted or something like that, then the finding of two different DNA types from that one individual raises the possibility of cross-contamination at some point. Now, if you've got cross-contamination at one point, you can have cross-contamination at a number of points. And therefore, you then need to know, well, if your DNA from your leg bone is of one type and your DNA from the skull or the contents of the skull is another type, either of them could be correct. Of course, there's another possibility, and that is that neither are correct. And they all relate to cross-contamination.
That cross-contamination could be explained by the fact that the bones had laid in that damp South African grave for almost 30 years. Both Professor Sykes and Professor Ranson suggest that during that time, the original DNA could have leached away and been replaced by another DNA that had leached in from a neighbouring grave. In that case, we have no alternative but to discount the DNA results given to us by Oxford University and rely more on the results given to us by Sheffield and Manchester universities. Couple these results to the stories told by Granny Alina to Louis and Albert about her rescue from the back of that truck, told 30 years before any publication of the official account of what happened, and you are left with just one conclusion: that it was Anastasia who died in the hail of bullets along with the rest of the imperial family, and that in fact it was Maria Romanov who survived and escaped, thereby totally changing history and the entire myth surrounding the riddle of Anastasia.
Ночь